IDF commando units, helicopter deployed, supported by the Israeli Air Forces via airstrikes, struck or did a raid on a military base just south of Damascus. You see these Israeli commandos coming back, and they're carrying something between them, something that looks heavy. So in this case, the targets were at first Syrian soldiers that were stationed at a former, they call it a former military facility in the town of Al-Kiswa. That's about 5 miles south of the center of Damascus. And I've got on the map here so I can show this to you. So very close to Damascus. Actually, you could say if it's 5 miles from the center of Damascus, I would call that in Damascus, wouldn't you? So there were about 15 airstrikes around this area in order to secure the site for the raid that came in. It appears their objectives were twofold. Number one, it was to stop the Syrian forces under al-Sharaa from destroying or tampering with surveillance devices that were in place in the area that had been put there by Israel. But you wouldn't normally need to put troops on the ground to do that. And indeed, that's not why they put troops on the ground. They bombed the area first and killed, according to the Syrians, 9 soldiers who were in the area there. And then the other airstrikes would have been in places like on this road to stop or slow the response of other military units because they're so close to Damascus. Any other access route to the site that they attacked. Now, the second reason that they went there and they actually put troops on the ground has to do with surveillance devices that they recovered that had been placed by Turkey. Now, some reports say those surveillance devices may have been in place up to 10 years ago. That'd be during the reign of Bashar al-Assad, and they were Turkish in nature. What kinds of devices are we talking about here? These alleged Turkish surveillance devices that had been planted in the area. Now, some reports in English about this raid claimed that the Israelis dropped paratroopers in, and that sort of gave the impression that they had been parachuted into the site, dropped by parachute. If they had actually done an airborne mission with parachutes, it would have been the first time that the Israelis had done a mission like that in this war. And that would have been significant. But other sources say that there were 4 helicopters that came in and dropped off commandos. And so what we can surmise from that is that there were not parachutes, there were helicopters, and this was an air assault mission. It was a helicopter-borne raid into Al-Kiswa, backed up by about 15 airstrikes on nearby Syrian army and pro-Iranian militia positions. And those airstrikes were designed to soften up the target and the defenses and isolate that target site so that commandos could come in there and could spend time on the ground getting what they needed. So that's when they do their sensitive site exploitation, or SSE, where they drop in and they pick up everything of value. We're talking about cell phones, computers, papers, anything like that that might give some intelligence. They put it all in a big bag and then they carry that out with them. Apparently, these commandos were on the ground for about 2 hours. And so again, that's why you saw those 15 airstrikes all around the area, because they needed to keep the Syrian forces in the area off balance so that they couldn't respond with troops and get the troops into a big firefight. The most difficult thing to do is extract troops that are under fire. Sending those helicopters back in there would have been a very risky proposition if there had been a ground fight going on. So they did that to seal off the area. Now, this site is approximately 40 kilometers from the border with Israel, 25 miles or something. So again, these commandos were on the ground for about 2 hours, and they were retrieving documents, dismantling surveillance hardware, and gathering intelligence. Now, we're talking about listening equipment, potentially radar, because that location, go back to the map here. So from their location to the Israeli border, which is now here. They actually have a pretty straight shot at the border, almost line of sight. The raid removed those long-standing Turkish surveillance systems that could very much have given the Turks information that Israel didn't want them to have. The Turkish Presidential Communications Office condemned the Israeli airstrike on the Nasser hospital in Gaza a few days ago, calling it another war crime and an assault on press freedom. A couple of the Israelis have done investigations into what happened there. They've determined that Hamas did have a camera set up at that hospital that was filming Israeli troops and giving Hamas operatives real-time information as to the location of those troops. So that makes the hospital a military target right there. But not only that, we have the eyewitness account of one of the former hostages where she talks about how Hamas used the Nasser hospital for military purposes and for holding those Israeli hostages. So take a listen to what she had to say when she testified before Congress.
But it was a lie. They transferred me to a hospital. Now I know it was the Nasser hospital. They look us through the back entrance and walk us past all the civilians. In the hospital, there was an area which was closed off and used only by Hamas, with an armored ward. They look us in a room where we meet the third hostage. The next morning, around 10 a.m., they told us again that we are going home. They moved us on another room and made me undress to check I have no surveillance device on me. Later, they briefed us, checked us, gave us supplies, and told us to get into a car waiting outside. But instead of taking us to freedom, they take us to a tunnel. There we see more hostages, some of whom were my friends from my kibbutz near us. I saw Eitan Oren and David Kuhn still remain in hands of Hamas.
That hospital was a legitimate military target. That was Israel taking out a direct threat to its troops. Now back to Turkey. Turkey and Israel, even though they have been at odds over this war, they have actually worked together in terms of putting together a deconfliction channel that allows them, a back channel for them to communicate with each other so that they don't accidentally end up like shooting down each other's fighter jets or something like that over Syria. Because we know that Turkey has a lot of military force inside Syria. We know that Israel has a lot of military forces inside Syria. And what we really want to avoid, everybody wants to avoid, is a scenario where those two forces end up going up against each other, because then you've got one of America's strongest allies and a NATO member going head to head, and that would be very complicated and difficult for the United States to thread that needle. On top of that, though, tensions are very high between Turkey and Israel. And so Israel is spying on Turkey, Turkey is spying on Israel, especially in Syria. This is a spy rock that was actually found in the UK, in London, and it was emplaced by Russia. So it looks like a rock on the outside, but it's got some sort of electronic listening device on the inside. And apparently the Russians have been placing these things all over Europe, and probably the Israelis have been placing these all over the Middle East, things like this. Israel puts these things all over the place. Inside Gaza, inside Lebanon, inside Syria, inside Iran. They've got devices and cameras and microphones and stuff all over the place, okay? So on top of satellites and drones and other signals intelligence collecting devices, they put those kinds of things in. They also, any place where there's a cell phone tower, it's likely that they have some sort of device on that tower which picks up all the traffic that's going through that tower. We've seen that in use in Afghanistan, Iraq, lots of places. It's fairly straightforward and easy to jack between a cell phone tower and the landline that goes to the hub, some sort of listening device that picks up all the traffic that goes through that particular tower. What that shows is that Turkey has a growing intelligence footprint that Israel is countering and saying, yeah, that's too close. Sorry, you can't have that. So they went in and took that out. Now, that helicopter insertion, as I said, took about 2 hours. And then after they completed their objective, the team withdrew undercover by helicopter before the Syrian forces could regroup and get there. So apparently, according to some reports, Israel actually communicated to Syria via unofficial channels that any attempts to undermine its intelligence operations or tolerate Turkish espionage would trigger decisive action on the part of Israel. This is a very interesting war. Normally, a war is between two belligerent parties. You have two sides fighting each other. In this case, you have one country, Israel, fighting like 7 different places all around them. And so we just saw, actually right before I went live, the news came out that Israel struck Sana'a yet again. That's the second time in 2 days. And this time, it looks like they eliminated a bunch of high-ranking Houthi officials. And they did it by coinciding their strikes with a speech that was being given by the leader of the Houthis. The leader of the Houthis is like the leader of Hezbollah right now. He's in a bunker someplace and not coming out. He's in hiding. If he comes out and sticks his head up, Israel's going to take it off. So Israel did the next best thing. They waited until he gave his televised speech, and they bombed the places where the televisions were. Bottom line is they whacked some really heavy hitters in the Houthi organization. And that's in retaliation for the strikes that the Houthis continue to rain on Israel. They had 2 more yesterday. So what happened in Syria shows that Israel is making it very clear to the Syrian government, such as it is, that they are not going to back off of Syria. Now, they've actually been in talks with al-Jilani, mediated through Azerbaijan, to improve the relations between Israel and Syria. And surprisingly, even though Israel keeps striking in Syria, they have troops holding ground, quite a bit of ground in Syria, and they're controlling pretty much everything between Damascus and the Israeli border now. Even in spite of all of that, al-Jilani appears to be disposed to make a deal with Israel and to put something in writing that will solidify the relationship, codify the relationship between Israel and the new government of Syria. And I think al-Jilani looks at that and says, if I can make deals with my neighbors, it's going to raise my own legitimacy as the new or interim president of Syria. Because right now, that's still an open question, whether or not al-Jilani will actually be able to solidify his reign over Syria. He's got a lot of support, even from the United States, in doing that. But the United States is certainly encouraging them to make a deal with the Israelis so that the Israelis can rest easy, because they have maybe a similar deal with Syria like the one that they have with Egypt. Israel and Egypt have maintained peace along their border for 30 years or something now, for a long time. And so Israel would like to see something similar happen with the Syrian government, so would the United States. In the talks that the Israelis and the Syrians are having with one another, some of the conditions that Israel is laying out is that there's going to be limits on the size of your military. There's going to be a humanitarian corridor that is established between the Israeli border and the Druze village of Asweda. That way they can potentially visit their relatives back and forth, come to claim asylum, whatever, but have safe passage between Asweda and the border of Israel.